Back in 1974, Volvo would introduce what would eventually become their most recognizable and highest-selling car for decades, the 240. Originally part of a series, it also included the higher-powered but less popular 260. The 240 came from a 1972 concept car that would be the safest car they ever built, and quite likely the safest car on the road, especially in the U.S. market.
87% of all Volvo buyers are college-educated. The other 13% are just plain smart.
Although its square shape enhanced the car's strength and cargo capacity, it was a far different look than the curvy car bodies of the mid-70s, but would eventually fit right in with the overly square styles of the 80s. Only when the 80s square cars transitioned to the 90s bubble cars did the 240 finally look like a true relic of the past, leading to its end in 1993, but not until over 2.8 million were built. This is the story of the Volvo 240. This is my old car.
There were two sides to that billboard, and they both hurt equally.
In the early days of the U.S. automotive industry, safety was far from a priority, and emphasizing a car's safety features was even discouraged. This was because focusing on features intended to protect the car's occupants, such as seat belts, crumple zones, or reinforced roofs for rollover protection, made some U.S. consumers think the car must be unsafe. The short-lived Tucker in 1948 was designed to have seatbelts, but they never made it in, as the car's founder, Preston Tucker, had to accept the reality of the time, that they would make customers think the car must be unsafe if seatbelts were necessary. Nash Motors tried including seatbelts as an option in 1949, but most owners didn't want them or asked them to be removed. By the 1960s, cars sold in the U.S. typically had seatbelts, but usually only in the front seat, and only lap belts, not the shoulder belts that are standard today. Volvo's VESC concept, which stood for Volvo Experimental Safety Car, was built in 1972 and had automatic shoulder belts up front, along with airbags for both front and rear passengers. It also had a reinforced roof that could sport a fall from over 2 meters high, a steering wheel that pulled itself into the dashboard in the event of a front-end collision, headlight washers and wipers, and even a big dashboard screen that could display an image from a rear-view camera. Although that last feature didn't make it into Volvo's next model, the VESC's general design helped lead to Volvo's next model, the 240. Volvo was already producing the 140 when the concept was developed, and other than a slightly more angled front end on the 240, the two models look quite similar. However, the 240, which first entered production in 1974, incorporated more of the safety features from the VESC concept. Like most European automakers, alphanumeric designations were the norm then as it is now. And although this new model would later be called the 240 consistently across all variations of the car, it originally was the 200 series. The two digits that followed the leading two in its earlier years had specific meanings.
Take my Volvo.
Over the years, safety has been an obsession with Volvo. Because of all the things that go into a Volvo, the ones we've always valued most are people.
Be careful!
The middle digit was either a 4 or 6, and represented the number of cylinders in the engine, and the third digit was either a 2, 4, or 5, representing the number of doors. There were also letter designations that followed the three digits, which in order of status were L, DL, GL, and GLE, and sportier trims were GT, GLT, and beginning in 1981, turbo models. But as the years progressed, Volvo wasn't consistent with its own rules. For example, diesel engines, which were introduced in 1980 and Volkswagen designed, came in 5 and 6 cylinder variants, but were badged as a 240. The 240's first year of 1974 would be Volvo's best sales year for the US market, with over 2/3 of the 60,000 units sold being the 240 series models. This high number did not include any wagons or the V6 260 models, as the wagons wouldn't start until 1975, and the V6 until 1976. The high sale numbers are even more impressive when you consider the price of the most popular variant, the 244, averaged around $7,000 US, which for the mid-70s put it well into the luxury car market range. The 245 wagons were even more expensive, at close to $10,000 US, making them the highest priced wagons for sale in the US in 1975. Neither car was bought for speed or performance, as the 4-cylinder engine, which was often called the red block due to the engine's distinctive red color, had only around 100 horsepower. The V6 versions were the 262, 264, and 265. They first arrived in the US in 1976, and are more obscure to find today, as overall only around 6% across the entire 200 series had the V6, and were only offered between 1976 and 1982.
The Volvo 265, a working car for the leisure class.
The V6 engine was known as the PRV, as it was jointly developed between Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. If you find a 262 where the roof looks a little shorter than normal, that was a 262C, a special edition created by Bertoni, made between 1978 and 1981. This exclusive model actually started from a longer 264 and had its roof chopped to be nearly 4 inches lower and converted to a two-door model. Out of the 6,600 built, there were at least 5, called the Solaire, that were later transformed into convertibles by a California conversion company, although Volvo wouldn't endorse them, as the lack of roof eliminated one of the car's most important safety features, that being rollover protection. Although I'm surprised that Bertoni's chopping of the roof to lower the car's height was endorsed by Volvo, as that should have affected the car's structural integrity. If you watched my recent episode about old headlights on US spec cars, you know how headlights were forced into specific shapes and sizes to meet government regulations. It's these changes in headlights that were the easiest way to tell the various changes the 240 went through during its 19-year run. Initially, all models had dual round 7-inch sealed beams, but the V6 models got quad round 5 3/4-inch sealed beams in 1976, and the sedans and wagons switched to the same quad round in 1978. V6 models switched to quad square lights in 1978, as did some sedans and wagon variants. Along with a new-looking front end, the rear end had a few tweaks as well, but the overall square shape remained. All models got the quad square lights by 1981, and all switched to composite bulbs starting in 1986 until the model's end in 1993. Because composite bulbs were commonplace in Europe during the time sealed beams were required in the US, European owners also had wipers and washers for the headlights. But even when the composite headlights finally made their way to the US, the headlight wipers didn't make it here. By the late 70s, fuel efficiency was top priority among all the automakers, which is likely why the 4-cylinder 240 was far more popular than the V6 260. But Volvo had another advantage, a new oxygen sensor, developed in time for the 1977 model year. Volvo called it the Lambda Sonde, which fine-tuned the air and fuel mixture within the cylinders, which in turn cleaned up the emissions. This was especially helpful for cars sold in California, which had the strictest emission standards then, and still does today. Although fuel efficiency was still a high priority, the lack of engine power was finally starting to become a liability by 1981, and the V6, although a minority in sales, got a bump in power to 2.8 liters. 1981 would also be the first year of the turbo model, and not just the addition of a turbocharger, but the trim was also called turbo, the only time the 240 would ever have a trim name that wasn't just 1 to 3 letters. The turbocharger brought horsepower up to 127, a decent number for the early 80s. In comparison, the V6 made 130 horsepower, but was less fuel efficient, making the turbo the more popular option. By 1982, the turbo's power increased to 131 horsepower, and an optional intercooler was available in 1983, and became standard on all turbo models by 1984. Despite the 240 looking far from a typical race car, in the early 80s, Volvo offered a larger turbocharger and other performance modifications, which were shipped from Sweden with the performance parts in the trunk, uninstalled, when imported to the US. This homologation allowed the 240 to compete in the European Touring Car Championship. Not all the cars that were shipped to the US with the enhancement kit had the updates made, and those that did, with one exception, would later be returned to their standard form to sell them in the US. And yet, this was allowed to maintain Volvo's inclusion in racing, as the homologation rules didn't require that the cars keep their racing enhancements.
The thing is that it's basically a production car. That's the beauty of them. The engine's a 2.1 litre, 4-cylinder inline, the same engine that goes into all the Volvos sold all over the world.
Although Volvo used the 240 for racing in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, Volvo officially withdrew from supporting their racing program in 1986, although their cars would still compete for a few years afterwards.
Attention please, will the owner of the blue Mercedes license number please come to the parking lot. Your car has been in a minor accident.
Although the 200 series models in Europe would continue using the full 3-digit badging on the rear, with the last digit still representing the number of doors, the US models would revert to just 240 or 260 by 1980. For 1980 only, US models also dropped the subsequent 2 or 3-letter trim designations, but US buyers wanted the trim designations back, probably so they could tell whose car is better, so the trim badging returned in 1981. Volvo even offered a police package for the US market in 1982, touting the car's tank-like durability, but barely cracked that market that was dominated by US-built cop car options. Sales overall started to climb back to over 60,000 per year in 1980, after a slow decline in the late 70s, and the 240 represented over 90% of all Volvo sales in the US. By 1982, sales topped 72,000. Volvo had hoped to replace the 200 series by that point, but strong sales meant the 240 would stay on far longer than originally planned. Since the 200 series debut in 1974, and after its remaining 100 series models were sold, it had been Volvo's only model available in the US. This would finally change in 1983, when the Volvo 700 series would arrive. With the same right-angled styling as the 200 series, the 700 was larger and had more luxury features, and Volvo considered it to be their new flagship model. Initially only available as a 760 with a V6 engine, it led to the end of the V6 260 by the end of 1982. Volvo would also offer the 4-cylinder 740 in 1984 to provide a lower price point to bring in more buyers. The 740 would also offer a turbo model, which led to the turbo in the 240 to be dropped after 1985. And by 1985, the two-door 240 was dropped due to sagging sales, leaving just the 240 sedan and wagon. With the new 745 estate added in 1985, it was looking increasingly clear that Volvo was focusing more of its attention to its new 700 series, and that the 240 was nearing its end. It wasn't ending yet, but for the first time, Volvo had sold over 104,000 cars in the US, and only half of them were 240s. Along with the switch to composite headlamps, the rear end of the 240 for 1986 was also revised slightly as a concession to aerodynamics, and yet the overall square shape of the 240 was still the same. Although both sedans and wagons were still offered, they were all badged as the 240. The diesel engine was also dropped as an option, following the decrease in diesel's popularity among all automakers selling in the US. Although Volvo hit a new US sales record for 1986, with over 113,000 cars sold, the percentage of those cars being 240s dropped to 48%. So for the first time in its history, the 240 no longer commanded a majority of Volvo sales. However, it was this year that the total number of 240s sold worldwide reached 2 million. By 1988, the percentage of Volvo sales that went to the 240 dropped to 40%, as the 740 and 760 gained in popularity. Volvo was also selling a Bertone-designed 780 coupe, so all the 700 series cars were taking more and more of Volvo's attention for the US market. Although minor changes were made each year, the 240 still maintained its original boxy shape, but Volvo considered that shape as one of the car's best safety features. But by this point, other car models sold in the US were transitioning away from the boxy styles that dominated from the late 70s through the mid-80s. Although Chrysler had more boxy cars through the end of the decade, Ford and GM experimented with more curvy styling on some of their cars, and with the Volvo 240 still having the same basic shape for 15 years, its popularity was waning, although sales did go up slightly from 1988 to 89. It didn't help that both Lexus and Infiniti started in 1989 to offer new luxury divisions to compete with Volvo. Although Volvo would later lose two import competitors, as Peugeot and Sterling would leave the US market a couple years later. By 1990, a driver's airbag was added to comply with US regulations, but this was a somewhat late addition, considering how the original VESC concept in 1972 had two airbags. The 240 continued to score well in crash tests, and Money magazine ranked the 240 as the safest imported car for 1991, but this didn't help sales, as the 240 dropped to only around 22,000 sold that year. In fact, Volvo's US sales overall were down 25%. As a result, Volvo planned for 1993 to be the final model year for the 240. As a send-off, 1,600 models built for 1993 had special 240 Classic badging, more standard luxury features, genuine wood trim inside, and had individually numbered dash plaques. Although just to confuse things, these 1,600 models weren't the last models built, as they were built in March and April of 1993, whereas the final US spec model was built on May 4th, 1993. The final 240 built for the entire world was a specially made two-door wagon that remains in Volvo's museum in Sweden. Although more than 1 million 200 series cars were sold in the US and Canada over the course of its 19-year run, most cars of that age that still exist more than 30 years later aren't likely to be worth much. But thanks to the 240's reputation for safety, reliability, and relative simplicity, at least when compared to today's cars, there are far more 240s still on the road, and are commanding prices that will likely only go up. I guess maybe it is still hip to be square. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 70s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.